A wealthy woman pretended to be a simple employee in her fiancé's household, but her fiancé's family humiliated her cruelly, and everything changed when... I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Victoria Rodriguez gazed out the window at the cityscape, the view reflecting her success. At 32, she had achieved what few could imagine for a woman who grew up in a humble neighborhood. As the CEO of a tech company revolutionizing the industry, she was admired and respected in her professional circles. But tonight, as the city lights sparkled across the skyline, a shadow of doubt clouded her face. Her relationship with James Williams seemed like the fairy tale anyone would dream of. James, a charismatic and renowned lawyer with a smile that could disarm any heart, had recently returned from a long work trip. During an intimate dinner weeks earlier, he had casually mentioned that his mother, Elizabeth, was difficult to impress. The remark was made in a joking tone, but it echoed persistently in Victoria's mind. That night, James officially invited her to meet his family at what he called an informal gathering. To Victoria, however, the event felt like a precipice. She knew women like Elizabeth, elegant, sophisticated, and armed with a critical eye capable of dissecting every detail about a person in seconds. How would they see her? As a successful woman, or as someone unworthy of their privileged circle due to her modest origins? As she packed a suitcase with simple clothes, an idea began to take shape in her mind. It was risky but necessary. If she wanted to know how the Williams family truly treated people, she would need to hide who she was. She decided to pose as an ordinary employee, keeping her achievements and status a secret. Victoria folded the last dress into her suitcase and paused in front of the mirror. Her reflection showed determination, tinged with a hint of insecurity. Was this really the best way to uncover the truth? Before she could answer her own question, her phone vibrated on the table. The message on the screen made her heart stop for a moment. Isabella Mendez could be a problem. We must protect the family legacy at all costs. The message included a screenshot of an email, but the sender was unknown. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but as she reread the content, her mind connected the dots. Isabella Mendez was the fake name she had used to make a reservation at a restaurant weeks earlier when planning a surprise for James. How did they know about her alias? Victoria took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Could this message hint at how Elizabeth truly viewed anyone who approached James? Her initial plan to blend in as an employee now seemed more necessary than ever. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the exclusive neighborhood where the Williams family lived. The mansion was imposing, with perfectly manicured gardens and an entrance that seemed straight out of a luxury magazine. When she pressed the intercom button, a cold female voice responded. "Who is this?" "I'm Victoria, the new assistant James mentioned," she improvised quickly. There was a brief silence before the automatic gate opened. Victoria crossed the threshold with a mix of nervousness and resolve. Deep down, she knew this would test not only the Williams family but also her relationship with James. Elizabeth Williams greeted her at the door with a piercing gaze, as if she could dismantle her with a look. Her perfectly styled hair and impeccable outfit contrasted sharply with Victoria's simple dress. "I hope you're efficient," Elizabeth said, not bothering to hide her disdainful tone. Victoria nodded, keeping her head held high as a younger maid named Camila approached to guide her inside. Despite Elizabeth's distant demeanor, Camila's kindness was a small comfort. Throughout the day, Victoria observed every corner of the mansion and every interaction between family members and the staff. While cleaning the living room, she overheard Elizabeth speaking on the phone. "I can't allow someone like her to jeopardize the family legacy. James needs to marry someone on his level, not an opportunist." Victoria froze, her heart pounding. Who was Elizabeth referring to? Was it a general comment, or did she know something more? That night, when the mansion fell silent, Victoria retreated to the small room they had assigned her. From the window, she could see the city lights in the distance, reminding her of who she was and what she had achieved. But now, more than ever, she felt her relationship with James was at risk. Holding her phone, she reread the message she had received the night before. Something inside her told her this trip would not only reveal Elizabeth's true intentions, but also test her own emotional strength. In the quiet darkness, Victoria made a promise to herself. She would face whatever came her way, even if it meant exposing the truth about the Williams family. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The mansion's door closed behind Victoria with a soft yet intimidating click. The air inside the house felt heavy, not because of the surrounding luxury, but because of the constant sensation of being watched and judged with every step. Camila, the housemaid, offered her a faint smile as she pointed out where Victoria could leave her things. "You can put your belongings here, in this small room by the service wing," Camila said, gesturing toward an inconspicuous door near the kitchen. "Don't worry about Elizabeth. She's tough at first, but if you do your job well, she'll eventually leave you alone." Victoria nodded in gratitude, trying to stay in character. She couldn't afford to let anyone suspect she wasn't just an ordinary assistant. However, Camila's words made her wonder how long she could keep up the charade. The first day passed with small tasks assigned by Elizabeth, delivered in a tone of superiority. "Make sure there's not a single streak on those windows," Elizabeth ordered, scrutinizing Victoria with the intensity of someone inspecting a flawed gem. "The last person who tried cleaning this room did such a terrible job that I had to fire her on the spot." Victoria gritted her teeth and simply replied, "Understood, Mrs. Elizabeth. Don't worry, I'll do it right." As she worked, she couldn't help but observe the family dynamics unfolding around her. Carlos Williams, James's father, spent most of his time in his study, immersed in paperwork and speaking in a monotonous tone over the phone. He seemed indifferent to anything outside his own concerns. Elizabeth, on the other hand, controlled every detail of the house, from the arrangement of the flowers to the dinner menu. In the afternoon, while cleaning near the main living room, Victoria overheard Elizabeth speaking in the dining room. Her tone was different, lower, laden with tension. "We cannot allow someone like her to get any closer," Elizabeth said, pausing between sentences as though carefully measuring her words. "She has too many ambitions, and that's dangerous for our family. James deserves someone better, someone on his level." Victoria stopped cleaning and moved a little closer, straining to hear better. She couldn't be entirely sure Elizabeth was talking about her, but something in Elizabeth's tone made her feel constantly observed and evaluated. When Elizabeth hung up the phone, she turned toward Victoria. "What are you doing standing there? Hurry up with those windows. We have guests tonight, and I don't want them to see a single flaw." Victoria resumed her work, but her mind kept circling back to what she had overheard. Who was this she that Elizabeth saw as a threat? Was it her, or perhaps another woman on the family's radar? Later, Camila called Victoria to help set up dinner. As they arranged the silverware and prepared the dining table, they struck up a conversation. Camila was young, likely in her 20s, with a look that mixed weariness with hope. "How long have you worked here?" Victoria asked, feigning casual interest. "Almost 2 years," Camila replied with a shrug. "It's not the easiest job, but it helps pay for my studies. Someday, I want to become a business administrator. It's a dream, though sometimes it feels impossible here." "That dream is possible, Camila," Victoria said sincerely. "The road may be tough, but there's always a way to move forward." Their conversation halted when Elizabeth entered the dining room. "I expect everything to be ready in an hour," she said, casting her usual disapproving look at both of them. "I have no patience for mistakes, especially tonight." Victoria felt a pang of discomfort as she noticed how Elizabeth barely acknowledged Camila, treating her as though she were invisible. It was clear that Elizabeth saw the staff not as people but as tools to maintain her perfectly organized world. That night, after the guests had left, Victoria passed by Carlos's study to collect some plates that had been forgotten there. As she gathered them, her eyes wandered to a pile of papers on the desk. Among them, she spotted an envelope with James's name written in bold letters. Curiosity overpowered caution. She glanced around to ensure no one was watching and opened the envelope. Inside, she found what appeared to be legal documents related to property and stock transfers. What made her pause was a clause mentioning Elizabeth and Carlos as the primary beneficiaries should James decide to marry without a prenuptial agreement. Victoria's heart raced. This wasn't just about control. It was a meticulously planned strategy to protect the family's interests, even at James's expense. She heard footsteps approaching and quickly returned the envelope to the desk before slipping out of the study. That night, as she lay in her small room, her mind couldn't stop spinning with questions about how deep Elizabeth and Carlos's plans went. In the darkness, Victoria vowed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but she also knew she couldn't back down. The dawn at the Williams mansion arrived with the usual silent routine that Elizabeth cherished. Golden morning light filtered through the perfectly aligned curtains in the dining room, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. However, Victoria didn't have time to appreciate those little details. She had spent the night tossing and turning in bed, haunted by the documents she had found in Carlos's study. The idea that James's parents were actively trying to manipulate his personal and financial life unsettled her more than she cared to admit. As she adjusted the uniform Camila had given her the day before, she stared into the mirror and murmured to herself, "Just a little longer. I need to understand everything before deciding what to do." The first challenge of the day came during breakfast. Elizabeth, seated at the end of the long dining table, flipped through a lifestyle magazine while issuing orders to Victoria and Camila with the detached coldness of someone who felt entitled to be served. "Victoria, bring me the juice I asked for 10 minutes ago." "Camila, make sure the flowers are fresh before James arrives," she said without looking up. Victoria hurried to fulfill the orders, trying to remain calm while Elizabeth's words echoed in her head. James was set to return that afternoon, and the weight of her deception became heavier with each passing moment. Hours later, while cleaning Carlos's study, Victoria found another piece of the puzzle. Hidden in the back of a drawer, amidst seemingly irrelevant papers, was a handwritten letter signed by Elizabeth. In the letter, Elizabeth urged an influential acquaintance to consider inviting James to an exclusive event, emphasizing the need to keep him away from harmful influences. Although Victoria's name wasn't explicitly mentioned, the context was clear. A noise behind her pulled her out of her thoughts. She quickly returned the letter and resumed cleaning, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Later, in the kitchen, Camila approached Victoria with a tray of tea. "Have you noticed how Elizabeth always seems one step ahead of everyone?" Camila asked with a tone of near conspiracy. Victoria nodded, careful not to reveal too much. "She does seem to like being in control, but sometimes that can be dangerous, don't you think?" Camila looked at her curiously. "If you knew the things I've seen here, Elizabeth and Carlos have a way of making sure everything goes their way. But don't worry, as long as you don't cross their line, you'll be fine." Before Victoria could respond, the sound of a car approaching the main entrance caught their attention. Camila placed the tray on the table and rushed to the window. "It must be James," she said excitedly. Victoria felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared to face James under these circumstances. Before she could think of an excuse to avoid him, Elizabeth appeared in the room, adjusting her elegant blouse. "At last. I hope James brings good news," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then, looking at Victoria, she added, "You, stay here and make sure everything is spotless. I don't want my son to see any mess when he arrives." Victoria nodded, seizing the opportunity to stay out of James's sight for a little longer. From the kitchen, she watched as Elizabeth greeted her son with a brief yet calculated hug, as if to remind everyone who ruled the house. "James, it's so good to see you," Elizabeth said with a forced smile. "We have so much to discuss, and I hope you remember that tomorrow we have a very important dinner with the Arandis. It's crucial for our plans." "Of course, Mom, I know," James replied with a hint of impatience. "But first, I'd like to rest a bit. It's been a long trip." As James ascended the stairs to his room, Elizabeth turned to Victoria with a look that combined suspicion and disdain. "Make sure the living room is spotless before dinner. I don't want any surprises." Victoria got to work, but her mind was elsewhere. Every interaction with Elizabeth reinforced her belief that something dark lay beneath the perfect facade of the Williams family. Hours later, as she prepared the tea Elizabeth had requested, Victoria overheard a conversation from the dining room. Elizabeth was speaking to another woman over the phone. "We can't allow someone like her to get any closer to James," Elizabeth said in a low but firm tone. We need to ensure his future is protected. He doesn't need distractions, especially not from someone who doesn't share our values." Victoria gripped the cup in her hand tightly, feeling her suspicions confirmed. Elizabeth wasn't just judging her for her apparent social standing. She was actively manipulating James's decisions. The opportunity to confront Elizabeth came sooner than expected. As Victoria set the plates on the dining table, Elizabeth stopped her with a cold stare. "Listen carefully, Victoria," Elizabeth said, lowering her voice so Camilla wouldn't hear. "I know you're new here, but there are certain things you need to understand. In this house, respect for hierarchy is fundamental. Do your job, don't ask questions, and everything will be fine." Victoria maintained her composure and replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Understood, Mrs. Elizabeth. I'll do exactly what's expected of me." That night, while everyone slept, Victoria sat in her small room, mentally reviewing everything she had discovered so far. She knew she was in danger of being exposed, but she also knew she couldn't stop. There was something bigger at stake, something that went beyond her relationship with James. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would be a crucial day, and she had to be prepared for anything. As the mansion fell into silence, a black car pulled up to the entrance. From her window, Victoria watched as a man stepped out, holding an envelope in his hand. Victoria's heart began to race. Something was about to change, and she wasn't sure whether it would be for better or worse. The following morning arrived steeped in tension. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick curtains of the grand living room, where Elizabeth sat with a calculating expression as she reviewed some documents. From the kitchen, Victoria watched silently while preparing breakfast. Her heart raced as she anticipated the inevitable confrontation with James. The night before, she had run through all possible scenarios, but none seemed solid enough to avoid the fallout of her deception. Elizabeth, oblivious to Victoria's inner turmoil, lifted her gaze when she heard the sound of a car approaching. Her face lit up briefly as she recognized James's vehicle. "Finally," she murmured, closing the portfolio and rising with her signature elegance. Victoria felt the air grow heavier. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. She watched from the window as James stepped out of his car, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, his relaxed expression contrasting with the brewing storm inside the mansion. "Camilla, make sure everything is in its place," Elizabeth commanded, adjusting her pearl earrings. Then she turned to Victoria with a gaze mixing disdain and control. "You, stay in the kitchen until I call for you. I don't want my son distracted." Victoria nodded, swallowing her pride and the anxiety threatening to overwhelm her. The front door opened, and Elizabeth briefly hugged her son, a gesture as rehearsed as it was calculated. "My son, how wonderful to have you back," Elizabeth exclaimed, smiling with carefully crafted warmth. "Hello, Mom," James replied, returning the gesture. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Of course not, but we need to talk about important matters. Decisions need to be made, and well, you know I always have your best interests at heart." "Sure, Mom," James said with a tone that suggested he was used to these conversations. From the kitchen, Victoria listened to every word, feeling trapped in a crossroads. The moment to confront the truth had arrived, but she knew it would risk not only her relationship with James, but also her dignity. Elizabeth led James to the living room, offering him a cup of coffee. As he settled on the sofa, she began discussing the upcoming dinner with the Arandis, emphasizing how crucial it was for the family to maintain the right connections. "James, I know you've been busy, but it's vital to keep your social circle exclusive," Elizabeth said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "The Arandis are a respectable family, and their daughter Natalia is a charming young woman. I'm sure you'll find her interesting." James frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Mom, I hope you're not suggesting anything else. You know I'm in a relationship." "Oh, James, don't take it that way," Elizabeth replied, feigning innocence. "I just want what's best for you. And sometimes, the best isn't always obvious at first." Before James could respond, Camilla entered the living room to announce that the tea was ready. Elizabeth seized the opportunity to rise and head to the kitchen, where Victoria was preparing the tray. "Take this to the living room," Elizabeth ordered, handing her the tray with a look that felt like a challenge. Victoria took a deep breath and nodded, sensing that the moment had arrived. With measured steps, she carried the tray into the living room, trying to maintain her composure. As she entered, the sound of Elizabeth's heels clicking behind her served as a reminder that she was under constant scrutiny. James, upon seeing Victoria in a maid's uniform, froze, his expression shifting from relaxed to utterly bewildered. "Victoria?" he asked, standing abruptly. Elizabeth, caught off guard by her son's reaction, turned to Victoria with a mix of disbelief and fury. "What is the meaning of this? Do you know this woman?" Victoria took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back now. She carefully placed the tray on the table before facing James. "James, I can explain," she began, striving to sound calm despite the chaos in her mind. "Explain what? Why you're here, dressed like this?" James asked, his brow furrowed. Elizabeth intervened, her tone icy and authoritative. "This is unacceptable. Who are you really, and what are you doing in my house?" Victoria lifted her chin, determined not to be intimidated. "My name is Victoria Rodriguez, and I'm here because I wanted to understand what this family is truly like." James stared at her, still processing the situation. "You mean all of this was a plan?" Victoria nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "James, it wasn't easy for me to make this decision. But after hearing how your mother spoke about me and what she considers appropriate for you, I felt I needed to see things for myself." Elizabeth, visibly enraged, crossed her arms. "This is a betrayal. You have no idea what it means to be part of this family. And if you think you can come here and judge us, you're gravely mistaken." "Elizabeth, this isn't about judgment," Victoria replied firmly. "It's about honesty and knowing who we really are." James, caught between the two women, raised his hands to stop the argument. "Enough. Mom, I need to speak to Victoria alone." Elizabeth wanted to protest, but the resolute look in her son's eyes stopped her. "Fine," she finally said, leaving the room with deliberate steps. Once alone, James approached Victoria, his expression still filled with confusion. "Victoria, I don't understand why you did this. You could have talked to me directly." "I know, James," Victoria admitted, lowering her gaze, "but I was scared. Scared you wouldn't believe me. Scared you'd think I was exaggerating." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is a lot to process, but I need to know one thing. Was everything we had real?" Victoria met his eyes, her voice filled with emotion. "Of course it was. Everything I feel for you is real. But I needed to know if this love could survive everything else." The silence between them was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Both turned, confused, as Camila quickly entered the living room. "Mr. James, there's a man outside. He says he has something important to show you," she said, clearly nervous. James frowned, but before he could respond, the man entered, holding a thick envelope in his hands. His gaze shifted from James to Victoria, and his enigmatic smile made the air in the room grow heavier. "It seems I arrived at the perfect moment," the man said, handing the envelope to James. "This is something I believe you'll want to see." Victoria felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. There was something about the man's presence that was deeply unsettling, as though he knew far more than he was willing to reveal. James opened the envelope, and his face hardened as he read the documents. Without looking up, he murmured, "What does this mean?" Victoria knew in that moment that things were only about to get more complicated. The main living room remained silent, the opened envelope sprawled across the table with its documents scattered. James stared at the pages in his hands, his jaw tightening with every line he read. Victoria, standing a few steps away, felt her breath quicken. The mysterious man who had delivered the papers stood still, his neutral expression betraying a hint of satisfaction, as if savoring the chaos he had unleashed. "This can't be true," James muttered, his voice laden with disbelief. His dark, fiery eyes lifted to meet Victoria's. "Did you know anything about this?" Victoria shook her head immediately, though a part of her feared these documents were yet another piece of the enigma she had begun to unravel when she decided to infiltrate the Williams family. "James, I have no idea what those papers are about," she said firmly, though her voice carried a faint tremor. The man, still motionless, crossed his arms and added, "These documents detail financial arrangements between Elizabeth and Carlos to divert part of the family company's assets. What's interesting is how they tried to use your name to legitimize certain transactions." James abruptly stood, letting the documents fall onto the table. "This is a serious accusation. What's your stake in all this?" "I'm just doing my job," the man replied calmly. "Julian Montez, private investigator. I was hired to look into irregular activities in the Williams family accounts. These findings led me here." Victoria felt a flicker of recognition at the name Julian. She vaguely recalled hearing it in passing during a conversation between Camila and another staff member, but hadn't paid attention at the time. "Who hired you?" James demanded, stepping toward him. Julian met James's gaze with unshaken composure. "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you now have enough evidence to question your parents." Before Julian could elaborate, Elizabeth appeared at the entrance to the living room, immaculate as always, but her steely expression revealed she had overheard part of the conversation. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice cold and authoritative. Her eyes moved from James to Victoria and finally settled on Julian. "Who is this man, and why is he here?" James lifted the documents and waved them in front of her. "Explain this, Mom. What exactly were you doing with the company's money? And why is my name involved in these agreements?" Elizabeth's composed demeanor faltered momentarily. For a brief second, she hesitated but quickly regained her posture. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, forcing a tense smile. "Those documents are old. I'm not even sure how they ended up in your hands. All of this can be explained." "Then explain it now," James demanded, his voice unwavering. Elizabeth stepped toward him slowly, ignoring Julian and Victoria's presence. "Son, I've done everything possible to protect this family. What you see in those papers are necessary measures to ensure our interests are safeguarded. You don't understand how these matters work." "Protect the family?" James repeated incredulously. "At what cost? Manipulating my decisions? Using my name without my consent?" Victoria watched in silence, torn between indignation and empathy for James. She knew what it felt like to face authority figures trying to control every aspect of one's life. "This isn't an attack on you," Elizabeth continued, her tone calmer but no less commanding. "It's for your own good, for all of us. And that's why you tried to set me up with Natalia Aranda?" James spat, his words dripping with bitterness. "You think I don't know? Everything you do has a hidden purpose. When were you planning to tell me the truth, Mom?" Elizabeth remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was evident she hadn't anticipated James knowing so much. "James," Victoria finally intervened, her voice soft yet firm, "I think you need time to process this, but I also believe there's more to uncover. Elizabeth hasn't been completely honest with you, and it's worth investigating everything before making a decision." Julian nodded, backing Victoria's suggestion. "I'm willing to keep digging if you want, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are more people involved, and exposing them won't be easy." James looked from Victoria to Julian and then back to his mother. The weight of betrayal was evident on his face, but so was his determination. "Do it," he said finally, addressing Julian. "I want to know the whole truth. And you, Mom," he added, turning to Elizabeth, "you have a lot to explain, but not today. I need space." Elizabeth tried to approach him, but James raised a hand to stop her. "Please, don't make this harder." Without another word, he left the room, leaving Elizabeth standing with a mix of anger and frustration etched across her face. Victoria, though she wanted to follow James, knew it was best to give him time. Instead, she turned to Julian. "What else do you know about this?" Julian placed the documents back in his briefcase before responding. "It's not just Elizabeth. Someone else is pulling the strings. And I think we both have an idea of who that might be." Victoria nodded slowly, realizing the web of intrigue was far deeper than she had imagined. But she also knew she couldn't give up. At that moment, Camila appeared at the door, her face pale and worried. "Victoria, we need to talk. I found something you need to see." Victoria glanced between Julian and Camila, feeling the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place, though many were still missing. As she followed Camila out of the living room, Victoria couldn't help but wonder just how far Elizabeth would go to protect her legacy, and how far she herself would need to go to expose the truth. The tense atmosphere in the Williams mansion seemed to weigh heavier than ever, wrapping every room in an oppressive silence. Since confronting Elizabeth, James had avoided any serious conversations with her. His gaze was distant, his words clipped, and his tone icy. Meanwhile, Victoria felt that her role as a silent observer had reached its breaking point. She could no longer remain in the shadows while lies and manipulation continued to plague James. The following morning, Victoria found Camila in the kitchen, nervously wiping down the counter. "What did you find yesterday?" Victoria asked cautiously as she approached. Camila looked up and, after ensuring no one else was nearby, pulled a yellow envelope from beneath her apron. "They're records," Camila whispered, handing her the envelope. "Notes, bank transfers, and a letter written by Elizabeth to a business associate linked to an agreement about James's company. This isn't just about money. It's about total control." Victoria opened the envelope and began reading the documents. Her face shifted from surprise to anger. "This isn't just a family betrayal, Camila. This is a direct attack on James. He needs to see this." Camila hesitated. "Do you think he'll want to hear this right now? He's so hurt. I'm not sure he can handle anymore." Victoria took a deep breath, acknowledging the truth in Camila's words. It's better to face the truth now than let it consume him slowly. That afternoon, Victoria found James in the study, gazing out the window with a glass of wine in hand. His silhouette carried the weight of an unspoken burden. "James," she began cautiously. He didn't turn around but gestured for her to continue. "I need to show you something. Something Camila found. It won't be easy to hear, but I think you need to know." Finally, James turned, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. "What is it now, Victoria? Another one of my mother's secrets?" Victoria handed him the documents. "Not just hers. This is bigger. You have to see it." James took the papers reluctantly and began reading. As he progressed, his face hardened, his expression shifting with every line. When he finished, he dropped the documents onto the desk and rubbed his temples with both hands. "Is this real?" he asked in a near whisper. "Everything points to yes," Victoria replied. "There are bank records, letters, even personal notes from Elizabeth to someone named Joaquin Diaz. It seems she used him to ensure you couldn't make any major decisions without her approval." Joaquin's name sparked something in James. "Joaquin Diaz. He worked with my father years ago. He was fired for corruption. I can't believe my mother would turn to someone like him." Victoria stepped closer. "James, this isn't just about attacking you. It's an attempt to control your entire life. You can't let this continue." James looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and pain. "Thank you, Victoria. I don't know what I'd do without you." That evening, James decided to confront Elizabeth and Carlos together. He summoned them to the main living room, where the documents were laid out on the table. Victoria and Camila stood to the side as silent witnesses. "What is the meaning of this?" James demanded, pointing to the papers. "I want an explanation, and I want it now." Carlos was the first to speak, his voice tinged with irritation. "This isn't what it seems, son. These were decisions we made to protect you, to make sure you didn't make mistakes." "Mistakes?" James shot back, his voice rising. "Controlling every aspect of my life is protecting me? Manipulating my assets is protecting me? This is betrayal, not protection." Elizabeth, who had remained silent until then, finally intervened. "We did what we thought was best for the family. If you don't understand that now, you will with time." James let out a bitter laugh. "What part of this is for the good of the family? This is about your control, Mom. It's always been about you and your need to run everything." Victoria felt a knot in her stomach as she watched the family dynamic crumble before her eyes. While she knew this confrontation was necessary, she also understood that the wounds being inflicted would take a long time to heal. Finally, James made a decision. "I can't let you control my life anymore. From this moment on, I'm taking charge of my own decisions, personal and professional. And if that means distancing myself from you, then so be it." Elizabeth looked like she was about to respond, but Carlos placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Maybe it's for the best," he said with a sigh. "Maybe it's time you stopped relying on us and found your own path." James nodded, though his expression clearly showed that this resolution was not what he had hoped for. He turned to Victoria and Camila. "Thank you for being here, for helping me see what I didn't want to accept." That night, as the Williams mansion felt emptier than ever, Victoria and James sat together in the garden. The stars twinkled above them, but the tension in the air remained. "Do you think I did the right thing?" James asked in a low voice. Victoria took his hand and squeezed it gently. "You did what was necessary, and that takes more courage than most people have." For the first time in days, James managed a faint smile. "You know, I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have you here." Victoria looked into his eyes, sensing that something between them had changed, strengthened by the trials they had faced together. Yet she also knew their journey was far from over. At that moment, James's phone buzzed. When he glanced at the screen, his expression shifted once again. "It's Julian. He says he's found something else about Joaquin Diaz. Something that could change everything." Victoria felt her heart race. She knew that whatever came next wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it by his side. The night was cold and heavy as James drove toward Julian's office, the investigator who had uncovered the darkest secrets of his family. Victoria, sitting beside him, couldn't stop replaying the past few days in her mind. The revelations about Elizabeth and the documents that had exposed Joaquin Diaz still echoed in her thoughts. Yet, one lingering question remained. What else lay hidden beneath this web of lies? When they arrived at Julian's modest office, his serious expression greeted them. On his desk lay a thick file that seemed to contain answers no one had anticipated. Julian gestured for them to sit, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Julian began, taking his seat across from them. "What I've uncovered changes everything." Without wasting time, he opened the file and began explaining. Joaquin Diaz didn't just manipulate the Williams family finances for his own gain. He was also working with a woman named Gabriela Duarte, who used to be an accountant for the company some years ago. Together, they diverted funds and manipulated accounts, using James's name as a cover. James clenched his fists, his expression darkening. How is it possible that no one noticed this before? Why didn't anyone say anything? Julian met his gaze with solemnity. Because they had it all planned out. Joaquin and Gabriela knew exactly how to cover their tracks, and while your mother and father may have been complicit at first, they were also deceived. This level of manipulation doesn't happen overnight. Victoria gently placed her hand on James's, attempting to calm him. "This isn't your fault, James. What matters now is that we have the evidence. We can stop them before they cause any more damage." "That's true," Julian added as he placed a recording on the table. "I have recordings of conversations between Joaquin and Gabriela. But there's a problem. Joaquin left the country 3 days ago. Gabriela, however, is still here, and the authorities can use this evidence to interrogate her." James stood abruptly, determination flashing in his eyes. "Then let's not waste any time. I won't let this go unpunished." That same evening, Elizabeth sat alone in the mansion's grand living room, staring into the flames of the fireplace with a melancholic expression. Her actions had pushed her family to the brink of collapse, and though she tried to justify her decisions, she knew she had crossed lines she never should have. James's words echoed in her mind. It was always about control. Victoria entered the room quietly, her footsteps soft against the floor. Elizabeth looked up at the sound but said nothing. "Elizabeth," Victoria began, her tone calm yet firm, "I know you want the best for James, but the way you went about it only pushed him further away." Elizabeth turned her gaze back to the fire. "Everything I did was for his own good. You may not understand it, but I'm his mother. It's my duty to protect him." "Protect him or control him?" Victoria asked gently. "It's not too late to change. James needs his mother, but not one who dominates him. He needs someone who supports him." Elizabeth remained silent for several minutes before letting out a deep sigh. "I don't know if I can." Victoria offered a small smile. "No one expects it to be easy, but if you truly love James, you'll find a way." The next day, James, Victoria, and Julian met with the authorities. presenting the evidence they had gathered against Joaquin and Gabriella. Gabriella was arrested just hours later, and during her interrogation, she confessed to how Joaquin had orchestrated the manipulation of the Williams family finances. Her testimony became the key to exposing the entire corruption network. The story exploded in the media, placing the Williams family at the center of a public scandal. But James chose to face the situation with transparency. At a press conference, he took responsibility for restoring the company's integrity and pledged to correct the mistakes of the past. Victoria watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. She had seen James endure pain, betrayal, and doubt, but she had also witnessed his courage as he rose to lead with honesty. That evening, as the bustle of the mansion quieted down, Camila approached Victoria with a shy smile. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you," she said sincerely. "You didn't just help James. You made me believe I can aim for something more." Victoria returned her smile. "The credit is yours, Camila. You had that strength within you all along. You just needed a little push." Camila nodded enthusiastically. "I've decided to accept the scholarship. I'm going to study and build something better for myself." Victoria hugged her warmly. "I'm so proud of you. I know you'll achieve great things." Days later, James organized a dinner in the mansion's garden to celebrate the end of this tumultuous chapter. Elizabeth and Carlos made a genuine effort to reconcile with him, showing that change, though slow, was possible. Camila, beaming with excitement, announced her decision to start her studies, earning a round of applause from everyone. During the dinner, James took Victoria's hand and led her to a quieter corner of the garden. Under the glow of string lights, he pulled a small box from his pocket. "Victoria," he began, his eyes brimming with emotion. "These past months have been the hardest of my life, but also the most eye-opening. You've shown me the meaning of love, honesty, and courage. I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy filled Victoria's eyes as she nodded with a radiant smile. "Of course, James. I'll always be by your side." The guests, realizing what had just happened, erupted into applause and cheers. Even Elizabeth allowed herself a genuine smile, showing that, in the end, love and honesty had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. This story proves that while pain and betrayal can threaten to destroy us, love, courage, and the pursuit of truth have the power to rebuild us. By confronting their fears and embracing change, James and Victoria found not only justice but also a future filled with hope and unity. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.